Hello, my name is Shane Coughlin, and I am the General Manager of the OpenChain project at the Linux Foundation. Today, I'm going to give a short talk about high-level management of open source. Our talk title is Open Source Process Management, Standards for Licensing, Security, and more. The idea here is to talk about the type of processes you can use to manage open source, regardless of the specific project or the specific code. We're talking about how organizations, usually companies, manage doing open source software. Now we're going to talk about this by using the example of my project, the OpenChain project. The OpenChain project is going to be our first topic, and then we're going to talk about some of the things the OpenChain project does, and then we're going to talk about what's coming next year. So we'll have an overview of the OpenChain project. We'll have an overview of the ISO standard for open source license compliance that the OpenChain project maintains. We will have an overview of the security standard that the OpenChain project maintains, and then we'll talk about what's going to happen next year. Let's get started with the OpenChain project itself. The first thing I should say is that the OpenChain project is not about blockchain. The OpenChain project is about supply chains. It's about how do we manage open source software in supply chains. More specifically, it's about how do we make the supply chain more trusted when our topic is types of compliance, like license compliance or security compliance. How do we make that supply chain more trusted? The OpenChain project was started by a lot of different companies to address this question. On this slide, you can see the current board members of the OpenChain project. Companies going from silicon, like ARM and Qualcomm, through to companies working in automotive, like BMW, Bosch, or Toyota, to companies working in telecommunications and consumer technology, like Huawei, Cisco, Honor, or Oppo. Looking at just this slide, 24 companies on the OpenChain governing board, you will see all geographies, all markets, and many different company sizes represented. To be fair, all of these companies are big companies. That's because big companies have big supply chains, and they have a lot of work to do to manage those supply chains. These companies facilitate the OpenChain project so that thousands of other companies can come together and develop and use standards for making trusted supply chains. So they can develop and use standards around open source license compliance and open source security. And they can do other things related to this, like build reference material or training courses, talk about automation, and so on. We have work groups collaborating on licensing and security, or developing education material, discussing automation so that things can work faster at scale. And recently, we have started work groups for public policy and export control discussions. All of this is focused on trusted supply chains and types of compliance, but it provides a wide range of ways to look at these challenges and how open source software addresses these challenges. We have industry special interest groups in areas like automotive and telco and our official partner program. And we have local user groups located in different jurisdictions like China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, India, Germany, UK, and US, with more expected to appear in 2023. The user groups, of course, generally operate in their local language, providing an environment that is comfortable and welcoming for the companies around. Now, with all of these work groups and all of this potential, what specifically are we doing? The answer is, like I mentioned, standards. The first standard we built is called ISO IEC 5230-2020. This is the international standard, an ISO standard for open source software license compliance. We developed this standard in 2016 and brought it to market as a de facto industry standard. After some time, it became a formal ISO standard. It became a formal ISO standard in 2020. Nowadays, this standard is used across more and more of the global supply chain, across very different industries, from banking to automotive to infrastructure to consumer electronics. Basically, it is a simple process standard. Company by company, it provides the process framework telling you where to check for open source software, what to identify, and what to do next. It doesn't go into too much detail. It's a process standard, but it tells you where to put those vital processes. For example, the basic structure of the standard is to say, if you're a company doing open source, have an inbound process to identify the software and the license. Have internal training, policy, and process to make sure that the people dealing with the software know that license compliance is important and know how to address it. And then on outbound, double check what's the software and what's the license. The entire standard is only around 7 pages long. In other words, it's light. That means it's not too expensive and not too time-consuming to adopt. But once a company uses this standard, because we built it out of years and years and years of experience, we know the company will save real time, it will save real money, and as more and more companies in the supply chain use these standards, the supply chain will be more effective and more efficient. The last thing we want is to have a license problem somewhere near product or solution deployment. This standard helps to make sure that this does not happen. When we came to market with this standard, quite frankly, open source really needed it. We had a situation where open source licensing was well known and well understood by a few companies, but the very large global supply chain had limited access to the experience and knowledge necessary for great process management around open source license compliance. This standard, even though it's simple, was designed to address that. Now, interestingly, this standard, which is for license compliance, this standard was something that we saw being used in other areas. For example, the standard for open source license compliance, as hundreds of companies and then thousands of companies began using it, it started to be applied to other areas, not just license compliance, but also security. This was both interesting and obvious. The basic processes for something like open source license compliance and open source security compliance are mostly the same. For example, you want to identify inbound software. You want people to be trained on the topic, and you want to identify outbound software. Though, of course, there are some subtle differences. And when people started using our ISO standard for compliance in the area of security, we had to think about it, and we wanted to help them. The first thing we did was write a guide. And this security guide explained, okay, if you're using the ISO standard for license compliance in the context of security, here are some ideas on what are the most important parts. But then we went further. We did something that's very common in open source called forking. We forked the license compliance standard and made a sister standard for security. In other words, we took the same basic standard, we took out the license compliance specific parts and added in some security specific parts. This security assurance specification is much newer than the license compliance one. In fact, we only released it this year, 2022, so it is currently a de facto industry standard. It's an industry standard but it's not yet an ISO standard. We expect it to probably become an ISO standard in around middle or late 2023. However, it is ready for adoption right now as a de facto standard, and when it becomes an ISO standard, anyone using it will automatically be using the ISO standard as well. The security standard is very similar to the license compliance standard. I mentioned that we took out the license compliance specific stuff and we put in some security specific stuff. I was not kidding. The basic of the standard is identical. Have inbound processes, internal training, policy and processes, and outbound processes. But of course, instead of looking for what license is this, check if there's a known security vulnerability. These are subtle changes and it's our advantage. If you use the license compliance standard, it's super easy to begin using the security standard as well. Or vice versa. If you start using the security standard, it's super easy to begin using the license compliance standard. We did this on purpose. The idea was to build a family of interrelated standards that would help companies get a more trusted supply chain with the maximum benefit, minimum cost. We didn't want people to spend much time. We didn't want people to spend much money. We didn't want people to have to do huge changes or big reinvestment of their work. Now, I told you that there's a project to make a more trusted supply chain. I told you this project develops standards. I explained the standard for license compliance that the project made. I explained the standard for security that the project made. Now I want to talk a little bit about specifically what's going to happen next year. What can you expect from this project in 2023? What can you expect from the international standard for license compliance next year? What can you expect for the security standard? The first message is simple. You can expect the license compliance standard to continue growing. We have many companies using it, and it is going deeper and deeper into the global procurement cycle. More and more companies are saying to their suppliers, please use this standard when providing open source software. We are scaling from thousands to gradually tens of thousands of companies, and that process will continue next year. You can expect more of your supply chain to be aware of the standard, more of your supply chain to use the standard, and more of your supply chain to contribute to the future of the standard, usually by developing reference material or helping us do things like create training, etc. In 2023, you can also expect developments around the security standard. For example, I mentioned it is currently an industry standard. In 2023, we expect it to become an ISO standard. This will not change any of the basics of it. It will not change the requirements. It will not change the burden. But it will change the status from being an industry standard into having a formal ISO number. That formal ISO number is useful for things like procurement. Procurement departments like ISO numbers to put into procurement contracts. We are aware of this and we want to support it. Remember, our job is to go deep into the global supply chain. We want to make it as easy as possible, not just for engineers, not just for open source program offices, but also for sales and procurement to just get these standards used. In 2023, you can expect our global community not only to be pushing adoption of these standards, supporting adoption of these standards, but also developing a lot of reference material around them. We already have things like training material. We already have self-certification. We already have policy examples. We already have checklists and playbooks. We even have online training courses. But we have more to do, and we, of course, have more translation to do. Little by little, you can expect us to respond to market demands, where people say, we need a new playbook, or we need a new checklist, we will work to develop it as a community. We will work to translate it as a community, and we will work to share it across the supply chain as a community. Our project is an open source project. It's just like a software development project, except we don't develop software. We develop process standards, and we develop the supporting reference material to make it easier to use the standards. I want to invite you to be part of this work in 2023. We've had great success in helping the supply chain, and we've done a lot of things. But there is a lot more to do, especially around making it easier for people to turn up, to get informed, and to get help. Please join our local user groups. Please help out with our special interest groups, and please consider sitting in and/or contributing to our work groups. There is no barrier to entry for any of that. There are no fees. You don't have to be a Linux Foundation member. The only thing you have to do is turn up. We are a super, super open community. And that's because the global supply chain is large, complex, and the last thing it needs is any further friction. I want to thank you for listening to my talk today, and I want to thank you for your work in open source. Collaboration has led to some of the most amazing platforms in the world. Our challenge is to make sure these platforms can be used effectively by companies in the supply chain. In the OpenChain project, we do that through the perspective of a trusted supply chain in the context of licensing and security. Because of people like you, in organizations like your own, we've made huge progress since 2016. I think in 2023, we will see even more, and we will do it together. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the conference.